the only kind of victory he can win at this point is a Pyrrhic one. And I think that as with every passing day, things seem to go worse. The resistance of the Ukrainians is inspiring. The performance of Russian forces is poor. And I think that Putin's nightmare must now be that he fails quickly to capture Kyiv, and then has to resort to the kind of destructive bombardment that will only worsen his already dire international situation. The preponderance of forces still favors Russia, but what I'm seeing today makes me think that they are losing momentum. And that is very significant, because it starts to be possible that he doesn't even achieve a Pyrrhic victory and ends up instead with a protracted and inconclusive fight, which will, I think, require him to find a diplomatic off-ramp, and that's going to be hard now, very hard. There's a major war raging in Ukraine, and thousands of people are dying. That is not a great outcome. And I don't actually think it's a great outcome for Russia to be completely isolated and driven into the arms of China. To regard this as success deprives the whole idea of grand strategy of meaning. This is a failure. And it's a failure because the Biden administration made a series of mistakes that greatly raised the probability of war. First, they actually slowed down the pace of deliveries of arms to Ukraine. Then they lifted the sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And then they made it clear that they would only use sanctions if Putin acted. This was, I thought, a series of unforced errors that increased the likelihood of war, to the point that by January the 1st, when I wrote about this for Bloomberg, it was clear that war was coming. Then they thought, well, if we tell everybody that we know he's going to war in February, he somehow won't. But that was magical thinking. And the last and most amateurish move was to see if the Chinese would help, when the Chinese were obviously giving him a green light. Russia is not the Soviet Union. The Russia today has an economy the size of Belgium plus the Netherlands. And the United States and NATO have vastly greater military firepower. And yet we wholly failed to prevent this war because we did not make use of our strengths. Instead, we made a series of signs of weakness that Putin interpreted as weakness, not unreasonably. But you had to signal, like, you know, the US in 73, that you were arming the side that had been attacked. And we armed Israel in 73 sufficiently so the Israelis were not defeated, and then were in a position to negotiate a ceasefire. This is not what's happening right now. If the Ukrainians survive, it will be through their own determination and courage, more than through our efforts, I'm afraid. There were two ways to play this. Either you said, NATO membership is off the table. We are going to establish Ukraine as a neutral state with security guarantees, and we're going to do that with US leadership of the negotiations, which was what Henry Kissinger recommended now some 8 years ago. Or you made sure that the Ukrainians could defend themselves and deter the Russians from invading. And we did neither of those things. We said, in principle, you can join NATO, but how about never as the deadline? You know, there's a New Yorker cartoon of that, where the guy's on the phone and he goes, no, I can't do Thursday. How about never? Could you do never? And that was exactly what we said to Ukraine. The problem with adding Ukraine and Georgia to the list was that it clearly struck at Putin's sense of Russian security, More importantly, we didn't really mean it. And that's where I find we are most at fault. To have created this possibility without having any serious intention of its being realized was the height of irresponsibility. And I think it's certainly one of the reasons why this war has happened. Although when one looks at Putin's objectives in the two documents that were published by the Russian government late last year, which were like ultimatums, that those objectives extend beyond Ukraine's not being a member of NATO to include effectively demilitarizing the new member states of NATO, which I don't think is always intended to be a realistic diplomatic proposal. Certainly didn't expect such a dramatic change of tone and approach from Germany. I was impressed by the speed with which the Europeans moved. I think that has been one of the biggest surprises of the last 10 days. Yes, I think Putin was surprised by it too. He can't possibly have expected such severe sanctions to be imposed. His economy has been brought to its knees almost. And a major financial crisis is unfolding in Russia. And thirdly, yes, I think that the logical next step is to hit the Russians where they're at their most vulnerable, which is in imposing some kind of embargo on their oil and gas exports, especially the oil, which is the major revenue earner for them. We have quite a long tradition of Russophobia going back to the 19th century. After the failure of the 1830 revolutions, Russia as the despotic Eastern Empire was a familiar figure in British liberal and European liberal journalism. We have a tradition to build on here, and Putin has provided us with material to revive that old vision of Europe of Russia as a despotic menace to Europe. My sense is that this is one of those shifts that will have quite long-lasting cultural effects. Whether or not the effects are long-lasting in terms of policy is another question. German public opinion goes through spasms periodically. It had a great spasm of sympathy for Syrian refugees in 2015, you may remember, but it didn't last very long. And I think the great spasm of sympathy for the Ukrainians will perhaps fade when the bill falls due and you're told, well, here's how much more your energy is going to cost, and here are your taxes going up to pay for all the additional military spending. In some measure, this war has already gone beyond Ukraine's borders because of the sheer scale of the economic response. Also, I suspect there's quite a lot of cyber activity that is going on that is not purely Ukrainian directed at Russia. I think the probability of it escalating in terms of conventional forces is quite low because Putin really isn't in a position to fight anybody else and would certainly wish to avoid that. And as far as I can see, nobody in the NATO countries really wants to deploy forces to Ukraine. So the probability of that is quite low, I think, very low. The probability of a nuclear attack is also low because Putin's simply using an old Cold War technique, which is to raise your nuclear threat level to try to intimidate the other side. It's not plausible that he would use a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine. He proclaimed the historical unity of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples back in July. This seems like something that would somewhat be contradicted by dropping a nuke on Kyiv. So I think that was a fairly straightforward bluff. It worked because the Europeans suddenly changed their minds about lending the Ukrainians fighter jets, and it killed any discussion of a no-fly zone.